This is the case study assignment for EDL 851, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. Stress at home creates problems at school. I would like to start by identifying the problem. We know very little about Mrs. Horton. We know that she is a veteran teacher and has a history of quality instruction since she was a Teacher of the Year. We also know that she has at least had satisfactory instruction under Mrs. Wilson for 2.5 years. There's no mention of her having a problem or any mention of her being a bad teacher whatsoever or having negative reviews. So we know that she's at least satisfactory. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know about the history of professional development or any PD that she may have specifically received on the topic of social emotional learning, or SEL. We also don't know if she's had any contact with a union or association concerning any of these issues. We also don't know about the private conversation that Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton had, which could have included disclosing Ms. Horton's home situation. And lastly, we don't know the district's policy on administrative leave or any authority principals have in the district to grant leave. In the end, the problem, as I see it, is that Mrs. Horton needs to be removed from the classroom immediately without compromising her professional integrity, personal privacy, or violating her rights under district personnel or union contracts. Here's my plan. First, the professional thing to do would be a conference with Mrs. Horton. It demonstrates professional respect, but it also is something that I can document, that I would be able to document, to show that I have been working to address the issue. During the conference, I feel that I would need to outright address the changes in behavior and reports from the Board of Education, parents, and other teachers. Then I would need to directly discuss the rumors circulating about her marriage and kids. All these personal issues need to come to the front. Perhaps through these conversations, I would even have more. Perhaps through these conversations, we would even find out more actionable intelligence or actionable information about Mrs. Horton and figure out if there was other ways that we could help her. From this point, I would move to asking her how I could help her. I would share my personal life crises as well as what I've learned from them. If the conversation is going well at this point, I would even take the opportunity to make sure she is aware of any mental health benefits that the district offers through their benefit programs. They can be very useful, and I've accessed them. There's this kind of conversation should help demonstrate empathy and support and get her to understand that this is something that teachers go through. Now for the plan. I would not straight out ask her to leave the classroom or tell her that she needs to because of all these problems. I would explain that I am interested in implementing a new social emotional learning program at the school, and that I could use her help. We give her a chance to get out of the classroom for a bit and get her head back in the game. The specifics of what I ask her to do is on the slide, so I'm not going to go into it. Basically, she would work more closely with me on the program so I could keep an eye on her. I would reevaluate Mrs. Horton in a month and see if she was ready to return to the classroom. However, either way, I would ask her to work with a teacher's aide or long-term substitute for that month in order to help keep instruction on a quality level. The case would suggest Mrs. Horton is a quality teacher, so she knows how to teach, but just can't handle it at this moment. Letting her use her expertise to guide the TA or sub can make use of her knowledge and experience. Here I will talk about how to resolve the main issue, and that is that Ms. Horton needs to be removed from the classroom to prevent further infliction of emotional distress on the students. I chose to put resolve in quotes because even though Mrs. Horton is removed from the classroom, it doesn't really address her underlying problems. When I read this case, and then the assignment, I felt that the case was more about employee mental health and its impacts on students than it was about instructional capacity. I mean, Mrs. Horton didn't suddenly forget how to be a good teacher. She just wasn't capable of doing it at this point. I don't think that the case left a lot of room for the reader to theorize, or I also didn't like that the case left a lot of room for the reader to theorize about the personalities of Mrs. Horton and Mrs. Wilson. It also left out a lot of information about the climate of the school. What are the other teachers like? What are the students like? What are the demographics of the building? I just felt that there just wasn't enough actionable intelligence in this case. I felt that Mrs. Horton's room was not a safe and supporting learning environment for the students, and I wouldn't want my own daughter to be in the class. Since that's basically my standard, I knew that having her stay in the having Mrs. Horton stay in the classroom was not really an acceptable option. Being a parent, I can relate to what the other parents are feeling and how they would want it to be resolved. Something I felt that was important was that everyone's rights need to be respected, the parents, the students, and Mrs. Horton's. Over the next few slides, I'll be walking through my reflection on the case and demonstrating how my plan and solution will work to promote the academic success of every student, promote the well-being of every student, and enhance instructional capacity. First, I need to make sure that the solution is promoting the academic success of every student. Key issues to consider here are that Mrs. Horton was not acting in a way consistent with a quality teacher. The case doesn't give specifics about what she's doing in the classroom, but all the evidence on prepared for the conference, yelling at parents, stories about stories from the students, all point to her not being a quality educator. Also, removing Mrs. Horton alone doesn't address student academic success. We would need to replace her with someone that is competent and then support that replacement in the same way that we would support a new teacher. Overall, this case really isn't about academic success. Just looking through the case, there's no mention of Mrs. Horton's students' grades, test scores, success, or work in general. The total lack of reference in itself is evidence that the case is really about something else. On the previous slide, I already mentioned that Mrs. Horton was not acting like a quality educator, but she was also not performing in a way consistent with being a caring educator. The students are not being supported emotionally, and without these emotional supports, the students cannot learn. Furthermore, she was not creating an emotionally safe learning environment for the students. While the case isn't about student success, it is very much about the students' well-being. Removing Mrs. Horton from an instructional role seems like it would be the necessary first step. This is because moving her to a different group of students or switching just the students of the vocal parents would ignore the underlying issues that Mrs. Horton is dealing with. Ensuring the personal well-being of every student doesn't just mean every one of Mrs. Horton's students, but every student in the building. Here I'm going to end with going over how I would enhance instructional capacity, which also leads back to the previous slide of supporting the emotional well-being of every student. While I'd like to return to Mrs. Horton not acting like a caring teacher, to me this suggests that there isn't a school-wide social-emotional program. There may be something that supports the students, such as like a character education program or a positive behavior intervention program. However, it doesn't suggest that teachers have a in-depth comprehension of social-emotional learning skills and strategies. This is the kind of program that I would ask Mrs. Horton to implement so that I could gracefully remove her from the classroom, but also help her and other teachers become aware of the importance of the student's social emotional health. Through the school-wide program, I would help develop teachers' instructional capacity through professional development on social emotional learning. This basically wraps up the case. This being my first case study assignment for Fort Hays, I wasn't really sure I did it correctly. I still don't have access to a video or webcam for this assignment, and while I know the dancing talking hippo was a hit, I just decided to go simple this time. All right.